Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to forge a heavy-duty version of the classic chest hinge. On this type of hinge, the bent leg of the hinge gets mounted to the inside face of the box and the strap gets mounted to the lid. This size of hinge would not have been used on a blanket box. It was designed for toolboxes or chests made out of heavy timbers. I'm starting with an 18-inch piece of 1.5" by 1/8" inch flat bar. This is the total length that I'm going to need to forge both halves of the hinge. I'm going to forge the short half of the hinge first while it's still attached to the bar, and then I'm going to continue forging the strap out of the remaining piece. I start by folding over 3 inches at the end of the bar. This is actually 4 inches here. I misread my ruler not once, but twice. I did correct the problem before I actually forge welded, so from that clip on, everything's the right length. The idea here is just to get it roughly shaped around the pin. You don't want it too tight or too loose. It'll be refined later on. I continue refining the eye of the hinge at the vise. I have the jaws of the vise set very loose, just tight enough so the barrel of the hinge gets caught above the jaws of the vise, but loose enough so any unwanted material will just push through. In this heat, I'm really just cleaning up hammer marks or any marks that might have been left from the vise, basically just getting it ready for welding. When you're welding this hinge, you really just need to concentrate on the lower half of the weld. If this section of the hinge is solid, then you'll be able to forge out any of the gaps that might occur when you bend the hinge to its final shape. It's more important to keep the thickness in the upper half of the hinge rather than to have it welded. Here I'm just taking another heat to make sure that I have a good weld. Once I'm satisfied with the weld, I'll cut it from the bar. The next step is to cross-peen the lower half of the hinge. This creates that nice flare that you see on most of these hinges. This section of the hinge doesn't get mortised into the wood, so it can be a little more freeform. It just sits on the surface. The eye for the strap portion of the hinge is made exactly the same way as the lower half of the hinge, except that I'm only using about 2 inches of metal to wrap around, and I make sure that the weld is located on the back portion of the hinge. The trick to forging the tapered section of the strap is to bring the end of the bar to a point first. Once you get the end of the bar to a point, that reinforces the thin cross section and allows you to forge the rest of the taper very quickly. In the next few heats, I'm just going to concentrate on getting the taper that I want. I'm not going to deal with the thickness of the cross section until I'm ready to refine the final shape. Leaving the bar thicker allows me to work faster because I'm not always dealing with a thin cross section. If I were creating a number of hinges that all had to be identical, I would make sure that all of the cross sections were identical before moving on to refining the final shape. Making sure that all the blanks are identical at the end of this heat will allow you to get the consistent results that you need when you're doing the final shaping. Now that I have the taper that I want, I'm ready to start refining the cross section. I start by creating an offset about 3/4 of an inch back from the point. This extra material at the end will form the beam portion of the strap hinge. I'm working on an edge of my anvil that has a really well-rounded corner, and I've tilted the hinge up, so I'm using the anvil to cross-peen the extra material lengthwise into the strap. And as always, I'm using the last of the heat to refine the shape and clean up any hammer marks. Now that the rough forging is done on both halves of the hinge, I need to cut the hinge joint before I bend the lower half of the hinge to its final shape. I need to have both halves of the hinge flat so I can clamp them in a vise and mark the location of the hinge joint. Now I'd like to demonstrate how easy it is to mess up a hinge. When you're making a hinge that isn't symmetrical, it's important to have the section of the hinge that has the split barrel on the front half of the vise. And that's because the section of the hinge that's facing you gets the deepest saw cuts. Once those saw cuts are made, you're committed. That's the side that gets the split barrel. The back half of the hinge just gets nicked so you know where the location of that front section is. Here I had it reversed, and I just realized it as I pulled the pieces from the vise. It's not the end of the world, and there's certainly no structural reason for doing it that way. One is just as strong as the other, but you will have a hard time finding a historical example of a hinge that's cut that way. The lower section always has the split barrel. I don't know why, that's just the way they've always been made. Here I'm comparing it with the hinge that I made some time ago so you can see the difference. As far as I'm concerned, if you make both hinges the same way, no one's really going to notice, but if you do want to be historically accurate, you do need to get it right. Okay, so let's assume this was cut the right way so we can move on. The only specialized tool that you're going to need to make for this hinge is a vise insert that matches the thickness of the wood that you're using for the box. That thickness is measured from the inside edge of the barrel to the inside edge of the bend. For this hinge I'm using 3/4 inch lumber, so I've added a 1/4 inch piece to my vise insert, which was made with 1/2 inch bars. So this vise insert allows you to get the hinge set up very quickly in the vise without having to measure anything. Every single hinge is going to have exactly the same bend. Now that the rough forging is all done, it's time to go over to the bench and do the final fitting. Fitting the hinge joint is pretty much the same as I demonstrated for the butterfly hinge. You clamp the piece in the vise and you file it until both halves fit. You're not going to be able to clamp the lower half of the hinge vertically in the vise, but mounting it sideways gives pretty easy access to all the faces, so you can refine the edges fairly easily. Aligning the hinge joint is done by clamping the barrel of the hinge in the vise and using wrenches to bend or twist it into position. So here's the finished hinge all fitted and ready to go. You can file it bright if you want, but I prefer the forged texture, so I'm going to throw it back in the fire to even everything out. We'll see you next time.